Welcome back to our examination of culture, and today, which is our second installment in the series, we're going to have a different set of objectives and different set of topics within culture. Our first objective is to be able to compare and contrast ethnocentrism and xenocentrism. You should also be able, at the end of this lesson, to compare and contrast cultural imperialism and cultural relativism. Third and finally, you should be able to discuss culture shock. Now, as the set of objectives might have suggested to you, the topics today are going to be focused on what happens when cultures interact, when we interact or encounter other cultures. And we'll see that there are a set of possible reactions, and some of them might occur within the same person at various stages of their interaction with another culture. The first is ethnocentrism. The second is cultural imperialism. Third is cultural relativism. Fourth is xenocentrism. And fifth is culture shock. Now, we can see some of these elements within these images, but we may not have the terms for them yet. The terms are here, and you will learn them. In terms of ethnocentrism and cultural imperialism, well, we can see some of that here, with the cartoon image of Uncle Sam presenting to these other peoples, be they Native Americans, Hispanic individuals, people from the Philippines, all of these places having lost territory or been outright conquered by the United States. We see in this cartoon the ethnocentrism and cultural imperialism of United States actions at the later stages of the 19th century and into the 20th century. On the other hand, in this image, we see something called xenocentrism. Right? This is an image of several Japanese men, one and only one of whom is still dressed in what would have been traditional Japanese clothing. The other men have adopted Western dress down to the silk top hat. So those images show the reactions we're going to be looking at in more detail today. All right, let's move on to ethnocentrism. I'm going to put myself down here on the buffet. It's always a good place to be. Ethnocentrism means evaluating another culture by your own cultural standards. It's something you must be careful about. Sometimes if we encounter other cultures, there can be things that are strange to us. And our first reaction might be to evaluate them based on what's acceptable or what's seen as proper and normal in our own culture. For example, if we saw this image above, right, if we encountered that, two grown men holding hands, in this case these men are soldiers, holding hands, we might want to evaluate that based on our own cultural standards. And in our own Western culture, right, if we see two grown men holding hands in public, right, it might mean that they're in a homosexual relationship, or it might just seem unusual to us. But if we understand these men, they're Middle Eastern men, by their own standard, it's not uncommon for men who are friends to hold hands in those cultures. Right? We need to evaluate them and understand them in terms of their own culture, or we will end up misunderstanding the nature of their behavior. We can also see ethnocentrism in food. If you look at both of these images are of something that is commonly a part of street food. Now, this is, of course, being served on a nice, pretty bowl with a garnish, but this is a fertilized duck egg, and it is considered a pretty common and pretty popular street food in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. Your idea of street food, sitting in a Midwestern American classroom, is probably more akin to this. You might evaluate this as gross, right, or unusual, or even disturbing, right, because your cultural standards about street food or food in general include things that look like this and not things that look like this. Right? And yet someone who is used to eating this may look at our very processed, very, in their eyes, maybe bland American food and judge it as inferior to their own, right? If not also seeing it as gross, right? So ethnocentrism and our awareness of it gives us caution about evaluating others based on our standards instead of their own. Right. The second possible reaction when cultures encounter one another is cultural imperialism. You might think of cultural imperialism as ethnocentrism taken a step further. It is imposing your culture on another. You're no longer just judging them based on the standards of your own culture. You are, in fact, imposing your culture on the culture of another society. We see this image here in this political cartoon where cultural imperialism is not being seen in a negative light as the British, right, carrying the flag of civilization, right, being backed up by British soldiers and settlers, right, against the barbarism of non-English, non-European people. This is, of course, a political cartoon kind of glorifying or valorizing British imperialism. But make no mistake, right? This carrying of civilization is meant to impose it on what the British saw as barbarism. If you're feeling smug as an American picking on the Brits for their cultural imperialism, hang tight there. America has quite its own history of cultural imperialism as well, perhaps none more clearly shown than in American government treatment of Native Americans in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and which we, as Americans, tried to assimilate by force Native Americans into white American culture, forcing them to give up their traditional practices, language, dress, diet, means of obtaining food, tried to replace all of those with modes that would make them more like white Americans. And in the process, really tried to destroy their culture. We didn't just try to get them to behave according to ours, but sought to supplant their culture with our own. All right. A much different type of reaction is cultural relativism. And this is very much an opposite to ethnocentrism. This is evaluating a culture by its own standards. And this can be hard to do. In some cases, it's not. Right? This is the late Anthony Bourdain, kind of a famous chef and travel show host, and he was quite renowned for his cultural relativism, right? Visiting different countries, experiencing the street food and the popular culture of those other peoples, right? And not judging them, but trying to understand and appreciate their culture and their societies for what they are. It can be more difficult, right? If we're trying to evaluate bullfighting, bullfighting is still a prominent sport in Spain. It is violent. It results and is intended to result in the death of the bull. If you're not familiar with how bullfighting works, the matador is supposed to weaken the bull, taunt him, pardon me, attack him with spears, and then ultimately kill the bull. This is often judged by other Europeans as barbaric, inhumane. There are organizations that seek to end bullfighting, but it is something that is seen as a valuable part of Spanish culture. And for you to understand it, whether you like it or not, if you just want to understand why it is still practiced, you're going to need to adopt cultural relativism in order to do that. You are not going to be able to justify it or understand it by your own cultural values. All right. Next up is Xenocentrism. Now, we saw some of this earlier. This is a kind of a different take of that image of the Japanese man in traditional dress, traditional haircut, surrounded by Japanese men who have adopted Western dress, Western hairstyles, Western headwear, the whole shebang. That's Xenocentrism. Right? Xenocentrism is believing other cultures are better than yours, with the implication being that you will often replace your culture with products from other cultures. This was not only a matter of dress and hairstyles in Japan, but also the adoption of modern technology. Japan went very officially xenocentric. They brought in engineers from Europe and America. They brought in government officials from notably places like Prussia, which would later become part of unified Germany, in order to find the best systems of government, transportation, building industry, building up commerce, really trying to catapult Japan from a feudal society with samurai and shoguns into a modern nation state on the European model. That was xenocentrism, maybe in one of its most spectacular forms. And at the same time, we also see kind of the flip side of this, and this is, of course, being a fictionalized account. But the story of the last samurai is an American who has been a veteran of what were called the Indian Wars in the United States, where the U.S. Army went and pushed Native Americans onto reservations, killed them, moved them out of the way of settlers. And this character, played by Tom Cruise, is disenchanted, but he's hired as a military advisor to come to Japan. And, of course, he ends up becoming quite xenocentric and adopts the Japanese language, adopts customs, traditions, including the fighting style and armor and weaponry of the samurai, and ends up fighting against the modernized infantry with firearms that have become the new Japanese military. So xenocentrism from the other direction. But in both cases, what we see are, especially in the center and right image, men adopting xenocentrism, and it's reflected in, very visibly in their dress and the material culture they surround themselves with. All right, fifth, this is kind of off of our list. It doesn't quite fit on those other spectrums we've been looking at, but culture shock. I mean, as much as I might want to just drop my image down here and pretend that I'm Crocodile Dundee, I'll just put it over there. Culture shock is it's a feeling of discomfort and disorientation in a new culture. I use Crocodile Dundee here, not because it's a relevant and current pop cultural reference. This movie predates all of you watching this by quite a lot, unless you're watching it with your parents. Crocodile Dundee is this Australian from the outback who comes to New York City and is in for quite a cultural shock. At this point, he's never been surrounded by this many people, and he simply climbs up to get above it all, right? As he comes from a place where you could go days without seeing another human soul. Right? Also see it in eating in a fancy restaurant where the menu is in, I believe, French or Italian. There's a lot of discomfort, and there's a lot of disorientation for Crocodile Dundee. That's a pretty clear example of culture shock. And it's not uncommon. Right? Imagine the culture shock you might feel if you encountered that fertilized duck egg and somebody suggested that it would be perfectly fine and a good idea for you to eat it. You would probably experience some culture shock. All right, and that concludes part 2 of our installments on culture. Please check in soon for part 3 in the series. But for now, I hope you guys will have a good day, and I'll see you for Culture Part 3.